Hello. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Prevention Strategies concurrent session of the School Violence Prevention Summit. I'm Dr. April Zioli, and I will be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you're here. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. Only the presenters and moderator are visible and are allowed to turn on their audio and video. You will notice on the right-hand side that you can toggle between Q&A for the event and Q&A for the session. If you have a question for our presenters, please type them in the Q&A for this session. Be sure to indicate who your question is for by including presenter's name at the beginning of your question. Q&A will take place after all of the presentations, but we encourage you to send in the questions throughout the presentations so we can have a chance to review them. We'll answer as many as time allows. Each of our presenters will have 10 minutes to present. And I do want to remind you that there is one other concurrent session occurring at the same time as this. And as much as we want you to stay in this session and listen to these fantastic presentations, feel free to jump between sessions. Now, join me in welcoming our session presenters. I'm going to introduce everyone now so that there's no interruptions between the flow of presentations. So please welcome Dr. Dewey Cornell. He's a professor of education at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. Dr. Jillian Taranovich, who is an associate professor and director of the Crime Victim Research and Policy Institute in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University. And Dr. Chris Melby, who is a professor and director of the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Presenters, when it's your turn to present, please turn on your audio and video and then turn them off after you are done. Let us begin with Dr. Cornell.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the University of Michigan for inviting me. I did my doctoral and postdoctoral work in clinical psychology at the University of Michigan, so I'm happy to contribute. I do want to acknowledge the terrible shooting that you had, and certainly my sympathy and concern for everyone in Michigan who's been affected by it. And it's certainly a strong impetus for us to continue and increase our work. As you can see, my email is available. Feel free to contact me if you want more information. Next slide. Today, I'm going to address 3 questions. What is school threat assessment? What does research tell us about it? And what do we need to do next? Next slide. In recent years, threat assessment has been widely adopted. There are 39 states that either encourage or require schools to have threat assessment teams. And of course, many schools in Michigan are getting training. Next slide. Let me ask you, how many of you have conducted a behavioral threat assessment in your school? Before you say no, let me point out that this is just a fancy name for something quite practical that we do a lot in schools. When a student is angry or upset, we all do some kind of an assessment. That is, we gauge how serious the situation is and what this young person is going to do next. The question is, do we do this assessment subjectively based on our intuition, or do we use evidence-based practices and do a more systematic assessment? Next slide. Many schools, unfortunately, take a zero tolerance approach. They automatically remove the student from school, regardless of the situation. This has meant that many students have been removed inappropriately for minor misbehavior. Research tells us that zero tolerance does not make schools safer and does not improve student behavior. Next slide. The full name of the process is Behavioral Threat Assessment and Intervention, which we shorten to threat assessment, but it has 3 stages. First, we need an environment where students and teachers can report a possible threat. Second, we need a multidisciplinary team to evaluate the seriousness of the threat. And finally, we take actions to help the student of concern and reduce the risk of violence. Next slide. Now, there's a common misconception that threat assessment teams are somehow going to predict whether someone is or is not going to be violent. But literally hundreds of studies have shown over decades that we are not good at predicting whether someone's going to commit a violent act. But prevention does not require prediction. We prevent something by reducing risk factors. This is the public health approach. We can't predict who's going to have a motor vehicle accident, but we know how to reduce the risk of accidents. We can't predict who's going to get cancer, but we know how to reduce the risk. Similarly, in threat assessment, we reduce the risk of violence by trying to resolve the problem or conflict underlying the threat. Next slide. We try to avoid two natural errors: overreaction to threats that are not serious and underreaction to threats that are serious. If we use zero tolerance, we consistently overreact. Like this case of a boy who was expelled from school because he brought to school a tiny piece of plastic shaped like a gun that was part of his action figure toys. On the other hand, if we do not follow a systematic approach, we run the risk of underreacting when a threat is serious. Next slide. We developed our threat assessment guidelines in 2001. We published our most recent manual in 2018. And in our model, a multidisciplinary team gathers information about a threat and uses a decision tree to distinguish threats that can be easily resolved as not serious, which we call transient, and threats that are serious and require some type of protective action, which we call substantive. In all cases, however, we look for a problem, a conflict underlying the threat, and try to help the student solve it in a more reasonable manner. Next slide. Here's a list of our top 20 studies. I'm going to go over them one at a time. No, I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to give you a summary. Starting in 2001, we began with field testing our model. And then we conducted a series of controlled studies comparing schools using threat assessment with schools not using threat assessment. And in recent years, we've examined statewide implementation, first in 2,000 Virginia schools and currently in 4,000 Florida schools. Next slide. Let me summarize some safety outcomes. Schools using threat assessment have resolved thousands of threats to kill, shoot, stab, or attack someone. Very few threats resulted in violence, mostly a few fights. Our success doesn't make the news because nothing happened. We've also seen reductions in bullying and peer aggression, which often is not so newsworthy. But we have seen cases where threats of shootings have been prevented. We can't scientifically claim a causal effect because shootings are statistically rare and very difficult to measure reliably. But we certainly have such cases. Next slide. We have stronger evidence for other positive effects. In schools using threat assessment, students are much more likely to receive support services, much less likely to be suspended, expelled, or arrested. We can also demonstrate that students and teachers report a more positive school climate, and they feel safer in schools using threat assessment. These are important benefits of threat assessment that are often overlooked. Next slide. Threat assessment teams do not make disciplinary decisions, but their assessment can influence the school administration in deciding whether to suspend or expel a student. One problem is that some schools have justified suspending a student or even arresting a student as based on a threat assessment. Although when you look at these cases, it often appears they did not follow a threat assessment process. They simply labeled their decision a threat assessment. Now, critics have raised concern that threat assessment will lead to increased rates of suspension and increased arrest for students of color and students with disability. This is a very important concern that we have studied since the onset of our research. Next slide. Our research has found reassuring results. When students are referred for a threat assessment, we found no disparities for students of color and little or no disparity for students with disabilities in disciplinary outcomes or law enforcement outcomes. Next slide. There are studies in Colorado, Florida, and Virginia. I think these studies suggest that we could regard threat assessment as a tool for reducing suspension rates and reducing disparities. Next slide. Let me just show you results for a sample of 1,100 Florida cases. Students of color were not more likely to be suspended, transferred, expelled, or subject to law enforcement action than white students. Next slide. We also found that students with disabilities were not treated differently than students without disabilities. Next slide. We must make sure that threat assessment does not perpetuate or exacerbate the problems that are already observed in our educational system. Contrary to media reports, the available evidence does not support allegations that threat assessment is causing unfair or disparate outcomes. In fact, it's doing the opposite. Next slide. Of course, we need more controlled studies. We have a study currently looking at fidelity of implementation, and we need to look at longitudinal outcomes to see the interventions and support programs provided to these students help them over time. And because most of the research has been conducted with the CSTAG model that we developed, we need studies of other models. Next slide. We need to establish practice standards for threat assessment. We should be at the slide that says need for practice standards. We need to establish practice standards for threat assessment, such as who will be on the threat assessment team, what kind of training they need, and what kind of practices they should follow. Next slide. Our group at the University of Virginia is working with the National Center for School Safety, based here at the University of Michigan, to identify those standards and promote evidence-based practices in threat assessment. Next slide. Over the last 2 years, we've worked on a toolkit to help schools establish threat assessment programs. Next slide. In conclusion, school threat assessment has become widely used in the US, and there is supporting research, but we need studies to assure that can be implemented consistently and with high fidelity so that it is always a safe, effective, and fair practice. Next slide. Let me just say, I don't want you to think I did all this research by myself. This is my UVA research team. And also let me close by thanking the US Department of Justice for their funding of our research. I'd be happy to send anyone copies of our work or answer any questions by email. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. So today I'm going to be talking about what a large-scale systematic review of 6 decades of research tells us in a broad sense about the causes and consequences of school violence. Next slide. So the findings I'm going to present today were part of a review commissioned by the National Institute of Justice, and the full publication's available publicly online. A large part of the implications and findings also overlap substantially with another NIJ-funded meta-analysis on the sources of school violence and victimization published separately, which is also available online and shown here on the right side of the screen. So what I'm going to present today is based on the NIJ report on the left, which is an empirical review of 341 effect sizes of different predictors and consequences from 55 different meta-analyses on school violence, in addition to a supplemental review of 362 recent research studies. So in this report, just keep in mind, school violence and victimization were defined broadly as the threat or use of force with the intention of causing harm, either at school or during school-related activities. So this broad definition encompassed various forms of bullying, aggression, fighting, threats, and weapons offenses, which was consistent with what the literature defines school violence as that we reviewed. So based on the empirical review of existing meta-analyses, which was essentially like a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, we identified the top predictors of school violence and victimization, as well as the consequences most strongly related to school violence and victimization. So here you see on this slide the rankings from the review of systematic reviews for the top predictors of school violence perpetration. So it was found that the strongest predictor of school violence perpetration was delinquent or antisocial behavior. And this was a broad measure that captured various forms of deviant, aggressive, and externalizing behaviors. Other strong predictors you see here were attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, child maltreatment, peer rejection, and moral disengagement. Next slide. So here's a visual of the effect sizes. So you see the line in the middle represents 0. And so the further to the left or right, the stronger the effect is. So the strong mean effect size that you can see for delinquent or antisocial behavior suggests that youth who engage in antisocial behaviors, maybe outside of school, are also likely to engage in those behaviors in school. and also that past antisocial behavior predicts future antisocial behavior at school. On the bottom left, you can also see some moderately strong protective factors as well, which include school climate. Next slide. For school victimization, the top predictor was peer acceptance or social preference, and this was a protective factor. Other strong predictors were anti-victimization and peer victimization, which captured victimization occurring in schools, peer groups, families, and communities. The review also identified several moderately strong predictors of school violence victimization, including things like neuroticism, social competence, which was a protective factor, and violent school context. Next slide. Here you can see the distribution of the strongest effects, where again, the furthest away from the line at 0, the stronger the effect is, either in the positive or negative direction. So here you can clearly see peer acceptance and social preference in any victimization as the strongest by far on the left and right sides. So for peer acceptance, this effect indicates that youth who are more liked and accepted by their peers are less likely to be victimized at school. And the large mean effect size for any victimization suggests that really youth who are victimized outside of the school or in the community are also likely to suffer risks of victimization at school. Next slide. Now, since most of the meta-analyses that we drew from did not examine serious school violence, we did a supplemental review of recent research on serious violence specifically. So serious violence included things like bringing a weapon to school, committing aggravated assault, robbery, sexual battery, or perpetrating school shootings. So these serious forms of violence that occurred on school property or during school-related activities. So the most consistent and strongest predictors of serious violence were prior offending, victimization, and gang involvement. Other identified risk factors included mental health issues, suicidality, low self-control, access to weapons, having a preoccupation with violence, voicing threats for violence, low empathy, and poor coping skills. So these are not necessarily the same factors that predicted less serious forms of school violence, like bullying. Next slide. So the review of systematic reviews also uncovered various weak and null predictors of school violence and victimization, meaning that these things were almost unrelated universally to violence or victimization at school. So these included involvement in extracurricular activities, the presence of an officer or guard at school, the presence of visible school security devices, school size, student race and ethnicity was a really mixed finding, as was student socioeconomic status. Next slide. Now, as mentioned previously, the review of systematic reviews also assessed studies on the consequences of school violence perpetration and victimization on youth. So the aftermath of what happens after individuals are perpetrating violence or becoming victims of violence at school. So the consequence most strongly related to the perpetration of school violence was bullying. So this indicates that youth who perpetrate violence at school are at risk for bullying others at school or in other contexts. And other consequences that were more moderately associated with school violence perpetration included self-harm, suicidality, weapon carrying, school dropout, dating violence victimization, and violence perpetration. Next slide. For school violence victimization, again, the strongest consequence here was bullying perpetration. And the second and third strongest consequences were loneliness and low self-esteem. Other moderately strong consequences included depression, anxiety, suicidality, having headaches, self-harm, and various other somatic symptoms. Although these effect sizes weren't as strong, they're notable in that they're pretty serious health outcomes for youth. Next slide. So together, this review of systematic reviews and the supplemental review of recent research, especially on serious violence, tells us a few key things about the causes and consequences of school violence. First, youth who engage in violence at school or who are victimized at school tend to also experience those victimizations in other contexts, or they're also engaging in antisocial behavior in other contexts. And there's also a repeated cycle of violence as well, where victimized youth are actually most likely to perpetrate violence and have the strongest risk factors included things like child maltreatment and exposure to domestic violence there. The review, so in that sense, the review found evidence of this victim offender overlap, but we have to be mindful that violence and victimization are not necessarily the same things. And there are certain youth who are more vulnerable to victimization who are not at risk for engaging in antisocial behavior. And some of the differential predictors kind of shed light on that issue. And of course, too, the consequences of school violence and perpetration are pretty serious. With respect to victimization, though, intervention should probably be more inclusive to focus on emotional distress and not just behavioral consequences. Next slide. So, through reviewing this really large body of work, we also found several research gaps and needs. So, the first thing, which echoes what Dr. Cornell mentioned, is that research on serious violence is lacking. So, the majority of research that we reviewed focuses on bullying. So, studies of serious violence, particularly violence involving weapons, which is of greatest concern to policymakers and the general public, those kinds of studies are far more rare. So we don't really know with a lot of confidence the extent to which different forms of aggression or violence at school or otherwise share similar causes and consequences. And so from a policy perspective, it's really important to advance this work to know if the interventions that we can use to target less serious forms of aggression will also be helpful in reducing more serious forms of violence. Second thing is there's greater attention should be devoted to identifying kind of these causal processes that link various predictors and consequences to school violence and victimization. So the review indicated, for instance, that things like child maltreatment and peer rejection were strong predictors of school violence, yet little research has really measured the processes by which these factors actually increase the likelihood of violence at school. So possible mechanisms might include reduced empathy for others, diminished self-efficacy, emotional reactivity, but we're not sure exactly. And those kinds of studies are really needed to inform what kinds of effective interventions we can develop. The third factor too is that the review revealed that peer and social dynamics are critically important to understanding school violence. And these factors are best understood as part of these developmental perspectives that emphasize peer hierarchy, social status, and stigma. So we have to be really inclusive of the peer context. There's also a need for more longitudinal and mixed methods research, such as more ethnographic work, so we can understand the context and situations under which violence unfolds. And lastly, some questions remain over whether school violence and community violence actually have unique causes. Several risk factors for serious violence overlapped with community violence, but there's much more to learn in this regard. And so this kind of work could tell us a lot more about whether school-specific interventions are needed or whether community-based interventions can be effectively adapted to the school environment. Next slide, and that's all. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Melby, professor and director of the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. And today I'm going to be sharing the results, a small sliver of the results associated with a comprehensive school safety initiative that emanated out of a partnership between the School of Criminal Justice at MSU, the Genesee Intermediate School District, Genesee County, Michigan, and the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. All of my co-authors are listed on the side of the screen there. Next slide. I do want to acknowledge that this was funded by the National Institute of Justice as part of the Comprehensive School Safety Initiative, but the viewpoints here are of our team and not necessarily of the Department of Justice. Next slide. I'm only going to be talking a bit about a smaller part of the entire initiative, but we did publish a study protocol. So if you're interested in this study and everything that was kind of contained in it, feel free to go to the Health and Justice Journal to read all about what we did. Next slide. So today I'm going to focus on the describing a bit about the intervention that we came up with and tested. But do know that we're really focusing on the impact of this intervention in this presentation simply on school climate and perceptions of school climate. But the overall intervention that we implemented in 20 schools or in 10 schools in Genesee County, Michigan, was really a focus on integrating what we saw as evidence-based interventions. So there was some evidence already that these interventions alone can can have a helpful impact on school climate and school safety. And we tried to develop a comprehensive school safety initiative by including all three. So in particular, we focused on integrating restorative practices, which really are about improving communication skills, communication and disciplinary practices within schools to be more integrative and really focus on reducing the amount of exclusionary practices that schools were using. We also included mental health first aid training, and that's really focused on getting teachers and staff to understand the differences between student misbehavior more broadly and those misbehaviors that might be emanating from mental health crises. And finally, we also included a crime prevention through environmental design. So you can kind of think about the physical environment of a school, but also the way that students and staff might move around the school. So student flows that might create the opportunities for student misbehavior, whereas slight changes to that environment might help improve or limit the opportunities for crime and deviance. Next slide. Now, one of the limitations of comprehensive school safety initiatives oftentimes is that they're hard to implement, and they're hard to implement over time. So people may be trained in a particular new form of intervention or school safety, but they may go back to old habits. And so there's a lack of program fidelity. Well, to deal with this, we implemented what's referred to as our three-person leadership team. So as part of the project, and through grant funds, we hired a full-time school climate specialist who helped to lead this intervention within the school and helped to assist teachers and administration in implementing these three different evidence-based programs. We also included a school resource officer, a half-time school resource officer. Again, this was funded by the grant, but allowed a school resource officer to dedicate 20 hours a week to being part of the school environment and part of this three-person leadership team. In addition, we included somebody who was already part of school leadership. Sometimes that was an assistant principal or somebody in a similar role. And together, this group was really a problem-solving team. So they would monitor implementation across time, but also develop solutions to any common problems that the school might have been experiencing. Next slide. Now, anytime you're working with schools, we also have to be understand that we should also be thinking through multi-tiered systems of supports, or PBIS. In Michigan, we refer to this as MyBLISSy. And these three interventions really fit within this notion of multi-tiered systems of support quite well. So one of the common practices that was really universal throughout the school were classroom circles as part of restorative practices. Again, youth mental health first aid might be focused on students that might be at the second or third tier. So again, these different interventions fit quite well within the multi-tiered systems of support framework. Next slide. I mentioned before that this was a large-scale intervention and a large-scale evaluation. And so our study aims were quite broad. Next slide. But today what we're really focusing is on that first link really for our overall study goals, and that is, can implementation of these three evidence-based programs and the implementation of school resource officers, a school climate specialist, can that help to change school climate? Kind of that, like I said, that first link in the chain. Next slide. To study this, we had the fantastic opportunity through the support of NIJ to engage in a cluster randomized controlled trial across 20 schools. To be eligible, these schools were located in Genesee County, Michigan. These were elementary schools that had to have 2 of the 3 grades you see on your screen. So they had to have 2 of 4th, 5th, or 6th grades in that school. And their percent free and reduced lunch had to be 50% or higher. We had 20 buildings total, and we rolled this out in a staggered start. So the first cohort of schools that received this intervention in part of the evaluation, we had 5 treatment schools and 4 control schools. And then in the following year, we added another 11. So we had 5 treatment schools and 6 control schools in that second cluster in order to get up to our 20 schools in general. Next slide. Again, we collect a lot of data, both on outcomes, but as well as with process. Process was equally important. That said, next slide. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the teacher and staff surveys that we collected, and this is a longitudinal collection, as well as student survey collection. The results I'm going to share with you, however, are focused on the 5th and 6th grade. We actually had different data collection instruments with the fourth graders, just given developmental processes. And we really tailored those questions to be attuned to those fourth graders as well. So today I'm just going to be focusing on the fifth and sixth grade. Next slide. To capture things like associated with the intervention, we focused on a couple different domains. First, with teachers and staff, we wanted to know about their buy-in to really the pillars of this intervention. So things like mental health first aid, restorative practices, as well as their attitudes about school resource officers, because that was a very visible part of this intervention. And so we asked questions related to their abilities and support for things like mental health, attitudes about school resource officers, and attitudes about restorative practices, which can be controversial for some schools as they try to implement these types of practices. Next slide. And then we ask more general questions about school climate. So we want to know, a particular feature of this intervention was really about improving student relationships, student and teacher relationships, how the classroom environment, in improving the classroom environment, and then also a focus on both classroom discipline practice as well as school discipline practices, including reducing the amount of exclusionary practices that schools use. Next slide. So again, we asked students as well about the relationships with one another, their relationships with students and teachers, their perceptions of classroom experiences, as well as school discipline. Next slide. I won't spend much time on this, but we had a lot of data, as I'll describe here in a little bit. And so if you have questions about how we analyze the data, I do have a slide on this, but we'll move on to the next slide for the sake of time. Next slide, please. Response rates. One of the strengths of this study is that our response rates were quite high. For teachers, the active consent rate among teachers was 87%, and we owe that to our partners with GISD, who have a great relationship with the local schools, and people really responded quite well. We use passive parental consent rates for student response rates, or for student responses, and if you have questions about that, we can discuss that. So next slide. It was a randomized control trial. So one of the things I just focus on here is we achieved balance across everything with slight differences by race, ethnicity across school. Next slide. When it comes to programmatic outcomes and we focus on teacher results, we did see improvement across all three categories that we focused on. So support for mental health first aid training, support for SROs in schools, as well as support for restorative practices. So all three of those features seem to suggest that the program had an impact on willingness to engage in these practices. Next slide. Unfortunately, with that success, however, we did not see any differences across time, and this is up to 2 years post-program, on any of our measures of school support among teachers in focusing on school climate. Next slide. And unfortunately, we saw no changes in attitudes about school climate when it came to our student results as well. So while this intervention seemed to have an impact on people's attitudes about the interventions themselves, and it was disruptive to the norms of the school based on a lot of our process measures, what we didn't find was much change when it came to actual measures of school climate. Next slide. In the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but there's a lot of things, caveats that I'd like to point out. And one is COVID-19. That was absolutely a detriment to our study. We lost a full year of data collection because most of our schools, all of our schools, went on lockdown and changed the environment in total. But for what we've seen up until this point, unfortunately, we didn't see a whole lot of change on school climate. But we've learned a lot about implementation of a comprehensive school safety initiative, and I'm happy to discuss some of those findings as well. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for this informative session. We have time for just a couple of questions, and I'm going to start with one that was in the Q&A chat. And this gets to what we mean when we call something a predictive factor and when we say we can't predict violence. The question is, Dr. Cornell mentioned that research has shown that violence can't be predicted, but then we see Dr. Taranovich showing these predicted factors for violence. So how do we square that some factors can predict violence, but we can't predict violence?
So I think for me, we don't want to get too hung up on the language of predictors. You can think of these as maybe like correlates or risk factors, but they're not meant to be entirely predictive. And some of the correlations that I showed, were still in like the 0.3 range, which means there's still 70% of the variation unexplained, even for our strongest. So think of them more as correlates and not necessarily as determinate predictors, if that maybe helps. And I'm sorry to not clarify that language a little bit better. I don't know if Dr. Cornell, if you want to add to that.
I agree. We're actually both right.
Yeah.
I agree with Jillian 100%. There are lots of factors that statistically predict which group of people will exhibit more violence. But if we take all those factors together, and researchers have done this for decades, take all those factors and add them up and apply them to one person, our predictive ability is about, at best, 2/3 correct, which is not good enough for individual prediction. Let me give you another example. We know that smoking causes cancer and it's a huge risk factor. But knowing that you smoke doesn't tell me very much about when or what type or if you will get cancer. So it's a difference of individual versus group prediction.
Thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Meldy. Why is it that teachers become more accepting of restorative practices, but didn't change attitudes about the relationships they had with students or colleagues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one is I think when it comes to restorative practices, one of the fears expressed by teachers and school personnel in general is that a conversion to restorative practices actually might erode school climate. It might erode class disciplinary processes, right, where they may lose control of the classroom. And so it's oftentimes when you get done training in restorative practices where people realize that some of the practices are just as good, if not better, than what they've normally done. And so a lot of times they come to appreciate restorative practices, and some of their fears are quelled. I would say when it comes to school climate, like a number of social psychological processes, is really hard to change. People's assessment of school climate. So thinking about elementary schools, and thinking about the majority of students love their elementary schools. So heading into this, there was already high rates of school climate. Students like their teachers, they like the other students. And so changing that and improving that is oftentimes really difficult to do. Not impossible, there's room to grow, but there's also some psychological mechanisms there at play where it's really hard to get people to appreciate that across time because things just become normal. That's just their school day. And so it's actually really hard to systematically change school climate across time.
We have time for one more quick question for Dr. Taranovich. What do you think should be done about ADHD emerging as the second strongest predictor of school violence?
I think if we take it as these are children who maybe are being penalized for some of their externalizing behaviors and they're being treated, more reactively, I think recognizing that just students have different needs and express their emotions and behaviors differently. Mm-hmm. And while ADHD symptoms may be associated with aggressive behaviors at school, we want to also be mindful of how we treat those youth as well. So maybe being not so reactive and punitive and punishment oriented, but instead have other interventions that maybe teach different types of emotional regulation skills, or maybe change how we respond to youth, if that helps. Yeah.
I'm sure that helps. All right, we just have a couple of seconds left. So I want to thank everyone for joining this session. You will be receiving an evaluation survey within the next few days. We encourage you to fill it out to help us continue to grow and improve this event in future years. Please also fill out the evaluation survey to request continuing education credits. If you're not already a member of the Injury Prevention Center, please go to our website at injurycenter.umich.edu to become one and get access to our monthly newsletter with publication, updates, and events. As a reminder, all sessions today were recorded and will be available on our website in the coming weeks. I want to thank all of our professors for doing such a wonderful job, especially in the wake of the shooting at Michigan State University. And hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thank you very much.